Why does it have to be this way? I think you've probably noticed it. Life, and I mean pretty much everyone's life, involves a fair fraction of hardship, unfairness, brutality, disappointment, loss, defeat, callousness, cruelty, frustration, humiliation, generalized misery, tragedy, pain, injustice, strife, rejection, physical debilitation, sadness, and suffering. And at the end of it, the entire journey of our lives concludes with our utter and complete annihilation for all time. And so it seems fairly natural to ask, why on earth does there have to be so much of all of that? Basically, why does life have to be so hard so much of the time? Not all the time, to be sure, but a lot more often than seems necessary or desirable. And perhaps the first layer of explanation would go something like this. Life is hard because, well, because we're born to a tragic lot, to a realm of pain and difficulty, to a world that resists and frustrates our desires a lot of the time. And although life certainly has its pleasures, the point is that it also involves a fair fraction of suffering. As the Buddhists say with their usual trenchancy, life is suffering. And so, from that perspective, it's no accident that we're born into this world screaming rather than smiling and laughing. It's because from the moment we draw our very first breaths, we learn that pain is inherent to our existential condition. But, of course, recognizing all of that only defers the question, which then becomes, okay, but why does it have to be like that in the first place? And the answer to that probably depends a lot on our particular beliefs, on how we see the fundamental operative forces of life. So, if you're of a theistic persuasion, probably the answer would be something like, well, life's difficulty is ultimately an expression of God's will, perhaps in conjunction with our own sinful nature. On the other hand, if you're more scientifically inclined, the answer would probably lie within a nexus of interrelated scientific principles, because those principles ultimately determine all of reality, including all of human reality. On the other hand, if you believe that life is just a chaotic jumble of randomness and discord, then its difficulty lies in its fundamentally aleatory nature. But the point is that looking for a definitive, ultimate cause of life's pain and hardship is probably not the best way of exploring the phenomenon, because it usually just leads to an easy affirmation of our already existing cosmological suppositions, which in turn makes it hard to discover anything new or useful. And so instead of asking why life is so difficult, maybe a better approach would be to ask about what's making it so difficult. And beyond life's inherent suffering and hardship, probably the most obvious answer would be, we ourselves make it difficult. Through our illusions, our insecurities, our resistance to accepting reality as it is, our immaturity, our unrealistic desires and attachments, our excuses and evasions, our misbegotten forays into false empowerment, our penchant for self-sabotage, our overweening self-importance, and perhaps most of all, our reluctance to assume direct personal responsibility for the quality of our lives. And when you add all of that together, life definitely becomes a lot harder, both at the individual level as well as at the level of our shared humanity. For instance, let's think of an illustrative example of how we end up making life harder than it really has to be. Has it ever impressed you how much of human history is basically about how we go out of our way to create hell on earth? Open practically any history textbook and drink deeply. Quaff, oh gentle YouTube viewer, quaff the heady, intoxicating elixir of war, territorial aggression, conquest and subjugation, mechanized genocide, mass annihilation, and mass enslavement, usually justified by ideological insanity of every stripe and description. Maybe it's because someone has the wrong name for God or the wrong skin color. Or maybe someone just wears the wrong kind of shoes. But in any case, if history teaches us anything at all, it would be that we human beings are endlessly creative when it comes to generating hell on Earth. And okay, every so often, something nice does happen. Like Madame Curie discovered radium in 1898, yeah. Or Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. You can read about that in history books too. But then, in short order, we returned to generating even more mayhem, annihilating each other by the tens of millions during World War II, for instance. And then, as though that weren't enough, inventing the eschatological specter of worldwide nuclear Armageddon. The entire book of Revelation at the push of a button. A little bit like fast food. The McPocalypse, if you will. A quick and convenient eschaton for the modern world, because you deserve a break today. So, do you really think that all of that's just some sort of weird coincidence? Because I don't. I think it's because, as Arnold Schwarzenegger succinctly crystallized it in The Terminator, it's in your nature to destroy yourselves. But if all of that's true, then it seems natural to ask a more specific question. Okay, but how do we go about doing that? What are the principal habits and strategies that drive us toward becoming our own worst enemies? Well, I'd say that our first problem has to do with our general lack of self-awareness, because it's hard to avoid the pitfalls of self-destruction if we're not even aware that it's happening in the first place. But of course, becoming self-aware isn't necessarily an easy thing. But why? It might seem to be fairly straightforward, especially since we have much more immediate access to ourselves than we do to anyone else. Well, it turns out not to work that way, at least not very often. The first reason is that most of us actively run away from self-awareness. That's partly because it involves being unusually honest about our faults and shortcomings. Basically, all of the things that make us uncomfortable and that we wish weren't there. However, we also run away from self-awareness because when we start to perceive what we really are and what we're really doing, we're also confronted with the daunting possibility of assuming responsibility for ourselves. As Stan Lee of Spider-Man once put it, with great power comes great responsibility. And that would include the power that arises out of self-awareness. And while running away from all of that may make our lives a little more immediately comfortable, in the long run it just makes everything harder. The reason is that without self-awareness, it's suddenly a lot more difficult to perceive how we're generating most of our own problems, which in turn only exacerbates and perpetuates them. And after a while, it starts to feel like we've been radically disempowered somehow and are now beleaguered by an unjust and cruel world. And it's that unfair world and not ourselves that needs to change, which in turn sets us up for an immense exercise in futility. Because the truth is that the world will almost always stubbornly persist in being the world, whether we like it or not. And since we're starting to talk about the intersection between responsibility, empowerment, and self-awareness, let's say a little bit more about responsibility and its opposite, irresponsibility. Especially since I think that's a second thing that makes life hard. That's because when we fail to assume personal responsibility for the quality of our lives, our sense of happiness and fulfillment depends mostly on whether the world decides to satisfy us today or not. And the thing about the world is that sometimes it'll do that and sometimes it won't. The world is just capricious that way. And during the times when it doesn't satisfy us, we have little recourse but to sit around grousing and complaining and wallowing in our fundamental misery, none of which makes us any stronger or any better, which in turn only makes our lives harder. I think that's pretty easy to observe in our world these days. But on the other hand, I've noticed that people who do assume personal responsibility for the quality of their lives are rarely unhappy, at least not habitually. Sure, they're subject to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune just like everyone else. But all of that's just water under the bridge to them because they've somehow managed to locate a kind of power within themselves, and along with it, a palpable sense of direction and destiny for their lives. They don't have to sit around belly aching while they wait for the world to empower them, because they're already empowering themselves. And they don't need to try to change the world into something it's not either, because they've realized the truth of Gandhi's famous dictum that the real challenge is to be the change we wish to see in the world. In other words, they've realized that the actual locus of change lies within the hidden corridors and passageways of our souls. Basically, people who've assumed responsibility for themselves are in the process of becoming truly empowered human beings, luminous and radiant in all of the ways that human souls can be. But of course, to large swaths of our world, that's not what empowerment looks like. And so, in addition to our issues with self-awareness and personal responsibility, I'd say that a third thing that makes life hard would be the seduction of false empowerment. Basically, false empowerment is a way of investing our time and energy in projects and ideas that are supposed to empower us, but that don't actually make us any stronger or any wiser. And of all of the ways that false empowerment plays out in our lives, I'd say that the most ubiquitous would have to do with politics. Sure, we like to believe that if we can just get our favorite politicians into office, then a brand new day will dawn, and the world will be healed, and everything will be just peachy. But I think that we all know in our hearts that that's not going to happen. Not in this lifetime and not in this universe. Sure, things that politicians do can make our lives a little bit easier, or a little bit harder. But the truth is that they almost never change us where we live and breathe, at the level of our souls, which is what really counts. The reason is that politics is hardly ever about that sort of thing in the first place. What politics is mainly about is allocating power and advantage in various ways, usually according to some sort of hierarchical gradient. And within the scope of that general project, politicians' own relation to power always comes first. And any tiny tidbits that happen to trickle down to you and me, well, at best, they're a very secondary consideration if they're in the equation at all. So, if you're looking to the political sphere for any sort of meaningful empowerment in your life, maybe because you're hoping that politicians will start catering to your own personal interests and preferences, well, let's just say, good luck with that. However, beyond all of the seductions of false empowerment, I'd say that a fourth thing that makes life hard has to do with authenticity. That's because the unsettling truth is that most of us end up spending a large fraction of our time living other people's lives for them, simply adopting other people's habits and values as our own, rather than creating a unique and authentic path for ourselves through this world. Of course, as in the case of responsibility, opting out of living authentically may seem like a good strategy for lessening the immediate sense of tension in our lives, but in the long run, it only makes life harder, especially since it actually takes a lot of work to worship other people's gods and to pretend like we're really sincere about it, to act like we believe in their values and agendas rather than our own. In other words, it actually makes life harder to be constantly pretending to be something we're not, always trying to dance to the rhythm of someone else's music rather than to the music that really moves our own souls. But I'd also say that for most of us, that's a realization that tends to come easier with age. When we're young, there's probably an irreducible amount of simple conformity and obedience that's required just to learn how to fit into the world. And that's perfectly understandable. After all, sometimes a little conformity, even if it's inauthentic, can help us meet life's immediate practical demands. And there's definitely wisdom in learning to choose our battles well. But woe betide anyone who never finds the courage to be truly and genuinely himself, who never becomes the artist and architect of his own existence, not even for a moment. I mean, think about it. Would it gladden your heart to know that at the very end of your journey through this life, the best and noblest thing you had to say was, well, I guess I always conformed? And, okay, it's a pretty personal question, but I think that unremitting conformity actually makes our lives a lot harder, especially in the long run, mostly because it doesn't really satisfy our souls. And it's a lot harder to spend your entire life always feeling like you just want to scream. But as important as our problems with authenticity may be, probably the biggest thing that makes life hard would be our lack of wisdom. After all, our general lack of wisdom is what makes it hard to cultivate more specific capacities, like those having to do with self-awareness, responsibility, authenticity, and avoiding the traps of self-destruction and false empowerment. However, the reason why cultivating wisdom is such an immensely difficult struggle for the human race, especially at this point in history, is that we're only now starting to develop the kind of consciousness that's receptive to wisdom in the first place. Basically, an expanded form of consciousness that's sensitively attuned to all of life's subtle signs and intimations. An uncluttered and undistracted type of consciousness that can apprehend reality directly, lucidly, and with relative equanimity. And while all of that may sound like a pretty tall order in today's world, I don't think it lies outside the bounds of human possibility. After all, if a few people can attain it, then maybe more of us can. And who knows, maybe if we can manage to develop that kind of consciousness across the wider social terrain and gain its correlative wisdom in the process, well, we might eventually discover that while a certain degree of suffering is probably inevitable in this world, life doesn't have to be as hard as it seems. Just a thought. Anyhow, yeah, thanks once again for your time and your attention. I definitely appreciate your willingness to listen to my ramblings. And I appreciate your presence in this universe too, in case no one's told you that lately. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.